I'm going to ask Professor and Dr. George Dei to please come up and give a presentation. And the presentation today is going to be fantastic. I really enjoyed the thunder that Mr. Dei brought yesterday, and I'm going to read his bio. George Dei is a professor and director of the Center for Anti-Racism Studies at OISE at the University of Toronto. He is considered by many as one of Canada's foremost scholars in anti-racism education. Mr. Dei is the pioneering voice in the establishment of the first Black or Afrocentric school in the Canadian school system in Toronto. In June of 2007, Professor Dei was installed as a traditional chief in Ghana. His chief name is Nana Sifa Atinabwa. Please welcome Mr. George Dei.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your words of wisdom. And, we can't say enough in terms of the land on which we stand and the teachings. And I, in particular, I'm always going to be very, very grateful, not only for the generosity, but also for the warmth and the fact that we do come into such spaces to share knowledge, to share ideas, but also that ideas have to compel action. That it's not enough to simply talk about knowledge, but how does that knowledge help us to act and to bring about transformative change? I also want to thank the organizers and thank you. I know this is Sunday morning, and I think the attendance is just superb to have such a large audience show up for a Sunday morning talk. Of course, being a chief in Ghana, I also want to recognize the elders in the room and also our ancestors who give us the spiritual strength, the guidance to be able to do what we do and get fulfilled spiritually, emotionally, and of course, culturally. Now, what I want to talk about is my current work, but it's something that goes a bit back in terms of one of the preoccupations of mine have been the search of what I call a robust epistemological framework. And in this search, what I focus on is the whole issue of indigenous epistemologies that would help us to destabilize, threaten, replace, and reimagine alternatives or countervisions to colonial thinking and practice. And you have to remember, I speak from the position of somebody who is in the Faculty of Education, and I think Suzanne was making this point about how schooling and education is so important in the lives of our peoples. And so for me, this search for a robust epistemological framework is to engage epistemological, indigenous epistemologies that helps to threaten, reimagine alternatives to colonial thinking. Now, there are three discursive positions in this search for a robust epistemological framework that I take. The first is that our epistemological frameworks must consider the body of the knowledge producer. Who is speaking? It's so important. And of course, the place in which one speaks and the context. This is so important because there's a connection between identity and knowledge production. We see the world differently. We make interpretations differently on the basis of who we are, where we're coming from, and how we be able to understand our identities and the connections with issues of history. But also, I think we can't talk of indigenous epistemologies without taking an anti-colonial stance. Because indigenous epistemologies are supposed to threaten colonial thinking. And what this means is to recognize that the anti-colonial is ultimately connected to decolonization. And by implication, decolonization cannot happen solely through Western scholarship. It is clear. We cannot be decolonized simply through Western scholarship because it is part of the problem. It has many things to offer us, I agree, but it is a big part of the problem. So when we say, for example, Western science doesn't agree, there are contestations around Western science, we know that Western science, there's a colonial thinking about Western science, irrespective of the tensions, the contradictions, and it's a fact. There's a hierarchy of knowledge, and Western science basically is way up there in terms of that. Then the third is that the complex problems facing our world today defy universalistic solutions. I think what it calls for is the possibilities of talking about multi-centric ways of knowing, doing, and being. When I talk of the universalistic solutions, I'm talking of the tendency for certain bodies of knowledge to masquerade as universal when actually they speak about a particularity, yet they masquerade as universal. And we need to subvert this. And the only way we can subvert it is to begin to talk about multi-centric ways of knowing in subverting the dominance of particular ways of knowing. Now, of course, when you engage in this challenge, you have to encounter some personal questions. And I think for me, yesterday, I mentioned the fact we have to avoid becoming what Inyamno talks about, intellectual imposters. We have to be true to ourselves, our authentic selves, as knowers who are grounded in our culture, in our history, on the land on which we live, and the land on which we practice. That we cannot be intellectual imposters within the academy through colonial, what Homi Baba calls colonial mimicry. Because when we do that, we are committing intellectual suicide, epistemicide. But it's more than intellectual suicide. We lose our souls, our spirits in that process. I also think for me it's very, very important for us to begin to pioneer new analytical systems for understanding our own communities. So how do we pioneer new analytical systems for understanding our own communities? Analytical systems that are steeped in our own homegrown cultural perspectives, as Nyanka talks about. And for some of us, and sometimes I'm included, and I think some of us are included, we need to replace that cultural estrangement, which seems to be moving away, further and further away from our cultures. We need to replace that cultural estrangement, as Nyamnot again talks about, with what he calls cultural engagement. So we engage our cultures because we are situated, we live through our cultures, and we engage our cultures critically, but it's not to be estranged from our cultures. In reclaiming such knowledge, we have to ask some questions. And these questions, for me, are grounded in my place within the school system. As someone who works within the Faculty of Education, who is working with young learners, working with young scholars who want to subvert, who want to decolonize our educational system. So the question becomes, for me, what is the role and place of indigenous philosophies? For example, proverbs, sages, cultural stories, fables, and tales in the pursuit of socially transformative education. Secondly, how can we provide anti-colonial education in ways that help our youth to develop a strong sense of identity, sense of self and collective agency, but also be able to resist through empowerment? This, is, to me, is one question to be addressed. We also have to ask, what is the role of local cultural knowledge in subverting the colonial hierarchies of conventional schooling? And how do we reinvent schooling and education in ways that espouse at the center such values as social justice, equity, fairness, resistance, and anti-colonial responsibility? You know, sometimes there's so much emphasis on we need to teach our youth about character education. What is character education? To me, what is character than to center the question of social justice and equity? That is character. So when a learner is able to ask questions about justice, social justice, that is character education. So it's more than the respect, it's more than the tolerance, it's more than the ability to value others. It's also to fight for justice, to fight for equality, equity. And that, to me, should be character education, to deal with the power issues. That should be character education. We need to theorize indigenous and indigeneity, and I think we all here are doing it. And I want to raise some issues from my standpoint, the way I come when I talk of indigenous philosophies, by way of theorization of what this indigeneity and indigenous mean. As we all know, indigenous to me is primarily about relations to the land and space. While on the other hand, indigeneity is about a process, identity, and resistance. But what is critical in these formations is the absence of colonial imposition And I'm not talking of romantic otherness. I think there's something to be said about indigenous, which is not romantic otherness. It is knowledge that has value on its own right, and it's not someone trying to romanticize about a past, about a culture, about a history, about a heritage. Clearly, there are contestations and contentions of the indigenous, I agree. There is no singular indigenous, nor indigeneity, but we do have categories of indigeneity. When I use indigenous, I convey a broad meaning of Aboriginal, African, Hawaiian, Australian, South African, American, Caribbean, extra local cultural knowledges. But I also claim the indigenous as an intellectual and political project of decolonization. And this point to me is critical because all projects, all decolonization projects require indigeneity. You cannot undertake a decolonization project without having indigeneity at the core or the foundation of that project. By embracing indigenous epistemologies, colonized peoples everywhere reclaim our indigenousness. But also, indigeneity is about new formations. It's about new identities. Yesterday, I made a point, going on some of what others have talked about, that I think we live in a cosmopolitan era, and I don't think our identities are fixed. New identities are being formed continually as we engage our world. Indigeneity is also about relationships. New relationships are being formed, and it's about subjectivities. But these are all crucial to the decolonization projects. Therefore, what we need to do is to challenge any insistence on a grand narrative or meta-narrative about indigeneity. It is complex, it's heterogeneous, and we need to resist any attempt to have a grand narrative about that. It is also critical, and I love this point, because sometimes for many of us, we think the advent of European colonization is the entry point of human history. But it is not. Colonization is not the beginning of the world. So the advent of European colonization is not the entry point of human history. To me, when you take this, it allows you then to begin to talk about indigeneity that is dynamic. It goes through time, through history. History that goes beyond European colonization. I think to me, I define indigenous knowledge as knowledge developed on the basis of, quote, long-term occupancy or unbroken residence of a place. In this case, land. And this I borrow from Boda. But what is critical about this definition is how we experience both the social and the natural worlds in terms of the interface of the physical and the metaphysical. And that, to me, when we work with that, we're able to talk about what body of knowledge comes with this articulation of the connections between the physical and the metaphysical. The binary of Western science knowledge, indigenous knowledge, is problematic. I agree. It is problematic to have that binary because knowledges tend to borrow from each other. I agree. But so is the claim that there's a universal knowledge system. That claim that there's a universal knowledge system is equally problematic because there's a tendency for some to say, well, there's no indigenous traditional knowledge and there's no Western knowledge because knowledge is borrowed from it. And then they conclude by saying there is a universal knowledge system. That claim is equally problematic. I don't think it is a contradiction to talk about knowledge borrowing, sharing, but also to acknowledge what some have acknowledged, which is that there are at times unbridgeable philosophical differences among knowledge systems. That there is what some call the incommensurability of knowledge systems. Certain knowledge systems, the ideas are not compatible, right? A knowledge system that seeks to control the environment, it's not compatible with a knowledge system that wants to have a harmonious relationship with the environment. A knowledge system that insists on rights is not going to be in coexistence with a knowledge system that has a core value on responsibilities. So we must be able to talk about knowledges borrowing from each other, but also be able to work with the idea that there are moments and times when knowledges are incommensurable, that there's incompatible differences, philosophical differences, and knowledge systems. I think I'm not the first to say this. There are many of us in the room here who have been articulating such. But it's very, very important for how we begin to talk about theorizing indigenous philosophies. What I do in my paper, after trying to theorize these things about indigenous philosophies, is then focus on an aspect of indigenous philosophies in the African context. And this is something that began about 4 years ago through the receipt of a Social Science Research Council of Canada award, where I began to look at indigenous proverbs and cultural stories, fables, parables, and tales in African countries, Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya. And I'm going to be sharing some of these things with you. But in order to lead to that, I decided to look at what exists in terms of scholarship in this area. It is clear that those who write, particularly on African proverbs, fables, stories, folk tales, parables, and cultural stories, make the point that these are all knowledge systems rooted in people's worldviews, or what Oyewumi talks about, world senses. That these bodies of knowledge underpin a social value system, and there's a methodology to how we come to know and understand and act in our worlds using these bodies of knowledge. That these bodies of knowledge also have a connection of place, spirit, soul, and the body as sites of healing. That these knowledges are not simply spoken or engaged simply for consumption, but there are moments when they become or they assist, particularly in terms of stories. In Aboriginal communities, we do have enough expansive literature about stories as forms of healing. Also, that these knowledges engage concepts of self, identity, and community, social values of respect, humility, responsibility, mutual interdependence, community building, sharing, honesty, greed, accountability, and retribution. I think when you look at from some of the stories, in Aboriginal context, we have the trickster stories that are about greed and retribution. We do have the Anansi stories in Africa too, in Ghana, where these stories are not about people being witty and cunning, but also talks about greed and the retribution. They are all supposed to teach certain ideas to young learners. And I was interested in this work to look at what are the teachings of these bodies of knowledge and how they assist in the schooling and education of learners. Now, in looking at the literature, it also became very, very clear that there's expansive literature that goes way, way, way back. I think as way back as the 60s, for example, we had such pioneering scholars as Abraham and Taylor and Wolfgang, who looked at the ways indigenous communities utilize proverbs, parables, folk tales, and mythologies to convey meanings of society, nature, and cultural interactions. Now, another dimension of the literature that is also expansive is in terms of Aboriginal traditions on storytelling as conveying powerful meanings similar to those that are embedded in proverbs, parables, fables, and tales in other indigenous contexts. And I need not bore you, you are familiar with some of the literature, particularly in Aboriginal traditions on culture, cultural stories. But what I saw in the African context is that much of the literature that exists is mere documentation. People simply document the proverbs, the folk tales, and the stories. But they don't move to the point of looking at the instructional, pedagogic, and communicative relevance of these proverbs. So it's one thing to say the proverb, but what does the proverb mean in terms of the teachings that will help young learners to navigate some of the challenges of contemporary schooling? And so when you look at some of the literature, it's more about the documentation. And the work that we sought to pursue was to move beyond the documentation to engage in the pedagogic, the instructional, and the communicative implications and relevance of these bodies of knowledge. So let me begin to share some of this. As I said, the focus was on Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya. So I'm just picking a couple of things just to, and I'm not going to have time to go in, but I just want to share with you. So, I'm on the Akan of Ghana, and by the way, I'm an Akan. That's my cultural. There's a saying that if you want to know how heavy a bag of salt is, you ask the one who is carrying it. And this to me is very important because it teaches people, particularly in the world where people think they know us more than we know ourselves, right? we have to challenge that idea, and that people need to be able to articulate, that people know themselves, and they need to be able to articulate without somebody having that colonial imposition, telling them who they are. Now, I can also say the arrogant goat knows the limits of its arrogance in front of the butcher's shop. This is about humility. Teaches about humility, because you know what will happen if the goat becomes arrogant close to the butcher's shop. He's going to lose his life. So it's about humility. And then there's the issue about history, the importance of history, which this proverb stresses, that the beard came to beat the eyelashes. That history is so important because history offers us lessons to understand not only the past, the present, but also the future. And this is a teaching that is embedded in that. And this idea of community, that rain does not fall on one house alone, that when the rain falls, it's not just one person who receives the blessing. It's shared. So there's the notion of the community. But also there's the teaching about responsibility, that we need to take risks. We need to take risks. Who fetches the water breaks the pot. And that risk taking is important if you want to accomplish something. Still on responsibility, there's a saying that if the mortar continues to travel afar, it gets palm nut to crack. And then questions about accountability, that when you take one eye, in order to see that you have taken that eye, you have to show it to the other. It's about, again, the question of accountability. Then the Kiambu of Kenya also talk about the importance of starting on a solid foundation, that you will end badly if you don't start well. Also, posterity, a good name keeps somebody. That shortcuts are not always the safest. Hard work, so important. Finding the easy way out are not always going to give you the results. And that we also have to inculcate ideas of sharing, that the starter may not always be the beneficiary. And so important for young learners to be able to be taught these ideas. That to me, these ideas need to be taught. And ideas to me can be transmitted. Ideas can be transmitted. It's practices. Ideas and practices are different. Ideas about respect, about communities, about responsibility can be transmitted. And they can be transmitted through such notions of these knowledge systems that I'm speaking to you here about. And then the Igbo of Nigeria have this saying to the effect that opening eyes widely does not mean seeing very well. Because sometimes there are hidden meanings that it takes more work to be able to inculcate, to be able to capture. And the question of elderhood is something that also is stressed in some of these teachings. That what a child climbed a tree to see, an elderly person sat down to see them all. And that stealing a drum is very easy, but where to play it is a problem. How can you play the drum without somebody hearing it? That's also crab legs cannot be stolen and eaten in secret. You all know when you eat crab legs, the noise. Somebody's going to hear it, the cracking. And that a step taken marks the end of a long journey. And finally, firewood gathered in the dry season is used during the rainy season. It's again preparing a place for the future. Moving from the proverbs to the stories. And there's so many stories I've decided just to highlight two. And I'm going to get your indulgence to read. But this is the story of the cat and the mouse. Again, it teaches about procrastination and sometimes why we need to take responsibility if you want to get certain things done. So a group of mice lived in a certain house. It happened that in that house also lived the cat. And the cat was always threatening the mouse. So the mouse decided they need to hatch a plot to be able to deal with the menace of the cat. Someone came out with a very nice idea that they should tie a bell around the neck of the cat. But the question became, who was going to do it? Because to go and put the bell around the neck of the cat means you're putting yourself in danger. And so there was this debate as to who was doing it. Everybody was coming up with excuses. This one says, oh, I was very, very sick. I just got healthy. My wife has this issue. I can't do this and that. So everybody was coming out with excuses and not being able to do it. So eventually, the king of the car decided, okay, well, then let's stop it. I think this, to me, is a very important story to be teaching to the youth. But if you want to get something done, then people must be prepared to take responsibility and be able to act. You cannot wait for somebody. And I think, to me, this is so important in that context, that how we engage these stories as a pedagogic tool, as a learning movement, as a teachable movement to work and engage the youth is so important in the youth that are so saddled with issues of the individual, that they think just about themselves without thinking about notions of the collectivity. And this, to me, is so important in terms of the pedagogic, the instructional relevance of engaging these bodies of knowledge. And another story about the three friends that lived in a particular place: the tortoise, the bird, and the twig. So the bird was always fond of singing. He's been warned that you have to be careful about this singing because it could get us into trouble. And he said, look, what I do is my business. Well, eventually he did something that wasn't just his business. It was the business of everybody. Because through his singing, a hunter found out where he was, shot the bird, but the bird fell where the tortoise and the twig was. When the hunter went there, he picked the bird. And then, of course, he found the tortoise also there, so he collected the tortoise as well. And to make matters worse, he used the twig to tie them both and took them to the house. So the action of one, in this case the bird, has implicated the other two. He wouldn't listen to the advice, but he got all of them into trouble. And this means very important to be able to engage this, because given the action of the bird, both the tortoise and the twig were placed in immeasurable danger. It's a question about we live in communities. What we do has implications for each other. And this is an indigenous teaching that is so important to talk about the interdependence, the community, the reliance, the bonding that needs to be stressed, as opposed to the individualism that one encounters in everyday society. And it's very, very clear that local cultural resource knowledge of indigenous peoples have been the least analyzed for their contributions to schooling and education. We need to do more and more of this. So in this case, the question of proverbs, the teachings of stories, the teachings of fables, the teachings of folk tales. So local cultural resource knowledge of indigenous peoples have been the least analyzed for their contributions to schooling and education. That indigenous proverbs and cultural stories echo values that underpin what actually is democratic education, not what we know it. In the sense that these challenge the harsh, competitive, individualistic models of learning and success that are instituted through neoliberal value systems of individualism, productivity, consumerism, and efficiency. And indigenous proverbs and cultural stories echo these values about democratic education, these notions about community, the sharing, the responsibility, as opposed to the competitive, individualistic models of learning. One of the things that I've said, that growing up in Ghana, one of the things that I remember in the school system was those of us who did well in school, we got our kick by helping those who were facing challenges. I don't see that when I teach my students at OISE. Because of the competition, everybody wants to get the A+. They don't want to share. I hear people come, oh, I don't want to bring this idea because somebody is going to steal it, right? That's part of the culture that we live in. And how do we challenge that? This individualistic, competitive mode of learning and education. That if you want to talk about success, your success is our success. We have many, many youth in schools, for example, who do well on the test scores. They are A+, they get A+. But they are very lousy when it comes to social relations. They're good on the test scores, A+. But when it comes to interpersonal relations, they're very, very lousy. How do we subvert that? That your success is the success of all. How do we get into this idea like if my kid is failing school and your kid is succeeding, you're not going to tell me that's tough luck for you, George. But my kid doing well in school and your kid failing in school means that there's something wrong that needs to be collectively addressed. How do we change that mindset? And trust me, this is not communism. African indigenous philosophies also highlight collective interests, while those of the West privilege individual self-interest with serious limitations in building healthy, sustainable schooling communities, what has been called community of learners. And bear in mind, when I say this, I don't mean that, for example, within, say, the West, everybody is that way. But I think by far, that is the character of the system. That's what I'm talking about. So you may have individual differences that shape, but the character of it is that we do value certain things, right? We do value the individual, we do value the rights as opposed to responsibility as opposed to the community. Look, in the African system, for example, there's a notion of the individual just as there's a notion of the community. But there's a difference between the competitive individual and the cooperative individual, right? The competitive individual is what we have here, as opposed to the cooperative individual. And then what happens is that in African teachings, for example, they will tell you that the individual is important. I think this is something that is all in all indigenous communities, that the individual is important insofar as he or she is linked to the community that they are part of. And that's the notion where the individual connects with the community. That also the engagement of indigenous proverbs and cultural stories shifts schooling towards a more needed multicentric or polycentric education model while challenging the Eurocentric model of humanism. It's very, very clear from some of these proverbs that we are working with. That African indigenous proverbs and cultural stories recognize a more open concept of morality as relational and communal, which allows for teaching discipline as opposed to enforcing discipline. One of the things that I've said in the school system is that in Toronto, for example, schools are very good in enforcing discipline, right? But what we need to do is to teach discipline. There's a distinction between enforcing discipline and teaching discipline. And we need to teach discipline and not spend so much time on enforcing. When we teach discipline, we will not have to enforce discipline. That's what I'm getting at. And that there's a need to reframe character education and to place at the center values such as social justice, equity, fairness, resistance, community building, and collective responsibilities. That character education is not just about respect, it's not just about being honest, it's not just simply about being able to do certain things right, but it's also about talking about justice, fairness, equity, dealing with issues of power, inequity that exists in our communities. In conclusion, I want to highlight briefly some issues and challenges in the study of indigenous proverbs and cultural stories. One of the issues has to do with the question of language and context, and the question of what many have written about, which is the loss in translation. In other words, proverbs and cultural stories speak to local contexts and environment. So there's always going to be the challenge of transferring these bodies of knowledge in ways that are decontextualized when they're being taught in different contexts. And we need to deal with that. So here I'm talking of African proverbs, stories, and folk tales. But I'm arguing that they are relevant for Canadian schooling. So there's a question of transferring these ideas here that we need to be. There's something that is going to be lost in that transference that we need to be aware of. Also, how do we, as indigenous scholars, use the colonial language, in this case, English? Western terminologies and logics, for example, I talk of epistemology, ontology, axiology, and technologies of vertical writing and digital scripts to address issues relating to indigenous ways of knowing. So how do we, as indigenous scholars, use the dominant language? Because there's something that is lost in translation. The Maori, I think, have done a good job at this second point. Let's use indigenous concepts. If you want to talk about these indigenous philosophies, it calls for indigenous concepts. And we cannot use these dominant terminologies to articulate that. There's also the difficulty of working with indigenous ways of knowing that do not fit the parameters of acceptability established by so-called modernity and modern knowledge. Again, a point that Andrew Lotti makes. I was making this point yesterday about sometimes we need to convey these ideas in order to make them legitimate and valid in ways that the dominant would understand. And through that process, we lose something. Also, the challenge of tradition and modernity split. I think to me, this tradition and modernity is an attractive allegory, as Loa does, but it's also a ridiculous imagery. I think the tradition and modernity are always connected. But the point I want to make here is that how do we deal with the corruption of proverbs and cultural stories as we seek to adapt them to culture, which is always changing, and modernity? How do ongoing transformations in proverbs and storytelling keep their original and authentic meanings? And how are changing trends in proverbs scholarship impacting the way indigenous proverbs are perceived in society and the academy? In other words, how has pornography influenced the status of proverbs in society? Of course, there are issues of gender and sexuality, culture and power in engaging proverbs cultural stories. The question of custodianship and questions of power. Elders are storytellers, who in some cases are exclusive male and adults. There are also unwritten social regulations in the use of proverbs, particularly in the African context and stories, that create gender in 8 dimensions. And also that indigenous proverbs and stories have deep sexual connotations and offer lessons about human sexuality. And how do we capture this? On this point about, it's not just about the gender, but it's also the dimension of age. In African cultures, for example, we talk about everybody can say a proverb, but it depends on where you say it. And being a tradition, being a chief in my, I think when I go to the palace when we are talking, right, and a young person is called to the palace in front of the elders, it's going to be a very strong young person who would be speaking to us in proverbs. We have to look at the person very carefully, that he is speaking to us in proverbs. So there's this age dimension to that needs to be addressed. And lastly, to me, bringing the idea of embodied connection to studying, researching, and teaching proverbs and cultural stories. That we begin to ask, are there some ethical concerns and questions of social responsibility when we force oral knowledges into corrupted written forms represented in dominant languages? What is the ethics of academic researchers presenting these bodies of knowledge in terms simply comprehensible to the dominant? And lastly, how do we co-produce knowledge with local communities in ways that fundamentally shift established ways of knowledge production in what I have called a co-relational status of knowledge production? Asante Sana. Thank you.
Chief Itinabwa, Masicho, give him a round of applause. He's traveled a great distance.